else I hear? So there is a group called the Central Oregon Woodworkers, or the Cows. I love it. Anyway, I went to one class so far, and it was a class where we learned how to sharpen and tune our hand planes. And that was awesome, by the way. And so now my hand plane is like, woo! Well, actually the hand plane I found out was garbage. And so neighbor gave me an awesome number 5 Stanley hand plane. Ah! So anyway, back to what I was saying. What was I saying? Oh yes, this class is for making mortise and tenons, and he says to bring a marking gauge. And so this is the marking gauge I have. And I think I'm gonna make my own marking gauge. I learned that the marking gauge has parts: the fence, the thumbscrew, the pin or spur, and the stem. So I watched a few videos and I decided on one design I liked by Garage Woodworks. Husband asked me to make him one for the class, so I made 2 at the same time. He cut some smaller pieces of different types of wood just to make it look nice, and it also makes it easier to make the stem hole because you don't have to cut out a hole in the wood. You just glue the parts together. I'm gonna buzz through this project real quick because I end up making another one after this, and I'll show that in a little bit. So for this first one, well, for these first 2, I glued part of the fence boards together, checking to make sure the stem fit into the space, and I set those aside. Then I took the stems, and for the marking thingy device part, I used a nail. One stem board was pretty easy to drive the nail through, but the other was maple, and the nail kept bending. So I drilled the pilot hole. I drove it through there again, and it bent again, so I tried to remove it. Ah, it's still bending. Oh, it's coming out though. Maybe I can get it to go in a little bit further. What do you think? See? This needs to go through a little bit more. Ah, rats. Okay, let's just take that out. Try a third one. I can get it out. This is the exact reason why things take me hours where it should only take like 20 minutes. Ah, now it broke. Oh, but maybe that's a good thing for me. Well, think that's far enough for a marking gauge? I'm gonna say yes. Okay. So the one that didn't break off, I cut off with the Dremel. And by this time, the fences were dry enough to add the last piece of the fence. So I checked to make sure the stems would fit again, and then I glued on the last piece of the fence. And I did that on both mine and the one I was making for Hub. Once those were dry, I squared them up on the sander, and some of the wood I used was a bit funky to breathe, so I used this big mask while sanding. The stem was tight on both of them, so I was going to use the hand plane, but I figured out I should have worked on this fit before I put the nails in the tips. So using the hand plane didn't work very well. It did on one side, but I couldn't do it evenly. So I ended up using the sander, and with that I took off just enough to be too much. Well, there's slop in both of these. Rats. So I imagine they're garbage then. So you can't have slop. So husband said this slop wasn't bad at all. And so he's gonna show me how to do a tap in there. And I have this set that Gerald Schultz sent me. Thanks, Jerry! And we're gonna go do that. Ah! So husband drilled into the wood and then used the tap to make the path in the hole for the thumb screw. And then I did it for the next one. And I thought I was really happy about them, but when we went to the class, I didn't even bring mine. And husband tried to use the one I made for him, and it didn't work well. And it's not because of the looseness, because you could tighten it up with the thumb screw. It was all about the nail. So I didn't drive the nail out far enough. The nail wasn't sharp. It just didn't work. It didn't mark. And so that design was just fine. And I could have only replaced the marking tip with something else, but I decided to make an entirely different model. So I watched a new video, and I'll leave the link for that video down in the description box below. So this one has two things on it that protect the stem from the thumb screw. A small piece of aluminum and a metal ruler. So I cut 1/8 of an inch or so piece of aluminum rod. Then I drilled a hole into the top of the fence and I put in a metal insert. And the aluminum piece will sit inside of the hole beneath the metal insert. Then I glued the fence boards together like before, but this time I was a lot more careful to make sure that the stem board was fitting well and that the cuts on my fence board pieces were square on the inside where the hole is for the stem. And when that was dry, I marked the fence to cut it down and angle it. I noticed when using the marking gauge that the square fence was a bit bulky. And so cutting off the corners not only got rid of that bulk, but it actually looked cool. So I cut those corners off and then I sanded it. So the ruler that goes on the stem is inlaid into the wood. And the guy I watched in the video used a router table to do this, but I set up a jig and used my trim router and did it by hand. And I wasn't sure if it was going to work out or not, but it worked great. And the little ruler has one end that is curved, so it fit perfectly right into the slot. And I happened to have a thin piece of copper that I got from Hobby Lobby, so I traced the fence and I put on some thick gloves and I cut the metal. Then I roughed up both the fence metal and the little ruler, and I used this Star Bond CA glue to attach the metal to the wood. And it worked really well. And I'm going to put a link to this CA glue in the description box also. It's called Star Bond and it comes in a few different viscosities, and I used a really thin viscosity for this application. I clamped those up and in no time they were dry and ready to move on. So I cut the stem to length. Then I drilled some holes into the copper and I used the Dremel to cut out the stem hole. And then I used a file to smooth the metal around the stem hole and around the fence. Then I sanded and smoothed the copper using different grits of sandpaper on my sanding stations that I put together. So I was trying to make this so shiny and pretty and smooth that I ended up sanding through the copper. So I quit working on that when that happened, but it is really super flat, and that's what I wanted. Then I worked on fitting the stem. It was a little tight, even after all the careful gluing, but this time I took it slow and I sanded a little at a time. And it didn't take much at all, and it slid right in. Then I cut off an end of an old hacksaw blade and I shaped it into a triangle for a cutter. Then I attached the cutter to the end of the marking gauge with a screw. And I tried it out. Look at that. Nice. I like it. Then I added some Danish oil to it so the prettiness of the wood would show and to give it a little protection. I think it looks pretty nice. So let's put it back together. Make sure I put my little piece of aluminum in there. And then I want this to go against the wood. There. So marking gauges, what's really cool is, doesn't matter what they look like, they all do the same thing. Figured out that the key is this, having a good fine tip. Having a ruler to measure stuff really doesn't matter because, do you ever really trust this measurement? No, I don't. And these were pretty loose, but then when you tighten it up, you know, you don't notice that looseness. But then you're making a divot into the top of this. But that's again where this comes in. So there are just a gazillion ways to make these marking gauges. And I think I like this one. It's nice and slickery here. And it just looks prettier. These, you know, look pretty cool too. But like husband said, didn't work well. I put in the description box a couple links to videos where I watched this one being made and these being made. You might want to go watch them instead of watching me, but anywho, I got it made. So thanks for joining me, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye.